Today we're going to be kind of investigating what optical debris is and why it has become an issue in today's world. We're going to talk about the problem, we're going to talk about the research behind it, and we are going to also identify 3 possible solutions in which could fix this problem or at least decrease the problem, and the pros and cons of each solution that I introduce. And I'm also going to tell you which solution I personally am in favor for and the reasons why I believe it to be the best solution. So let's start with what is orbital debris. Well, orbital debris is any non-functioning spacecraft, rocket bodies, refuse from missions, and other fragments within space, meaning that we as human beings will put out debris sometimes on purpose because we send spacecraft and satellites and other missions out to gather intelligence and research and data for us. Well, and in turn, when we do that, sometimes debris or space junk gets left behind unintentionally. Now, satellites and other spacecrafts explode after maintaining an orbit, thus leaving debris behind. That's how space orbit or orbital debris is created. It can stay in orbit anywhere from several years to decades or even centuries depending on the altitude of the orbit. Some space debris will orbit at a lower altitude, others will orbit at a higher altitude. But depending on where they're at in their orbit will depend on the lifespan that orbital debris will remain in orbit. When they don't remain in orbit, they basically will re-enter the atmosphere and burn up at that time. Alright, so what's the problem with having this orbital debris? Well, each time an orbit runs the risk of running into another object. You're thinking, how is that even a problem? The immensity of space is huge. How do these debris run into each other when space is such a big area? Well, the thing is, many nations that put things into space use the same orbits because certain orbits are more optimal locations for communication and gathering of research than others. The more we put in the same orbit, the higher the risk we are creating of the orbital debris running into things. So orbital debris has become an increasingly predominant issue due to certain locations being optimal locations for satellites. The more satellites in the same orbit, the higher the probability of collision, obviously. The more we put in one area, the more likely it is to collide. When we start having collisions, we're going to start having issues because if we have too much space junk out there orbiting around that's left over from previous missions, when we send a new mission out, it could hinder our results of that by hitting it and breaking it or causing the data to come back inaccurate or ineffective because we couldn't get the correct data back because it had a collision. Because certain orbits are particularly desirable for satellites used for communications and surveillance purposes, various nations and commercial interests place their satellites into these positions, thereby increasing the chances of collision. So just again, some research pulled from an article about the reason orbital debris has become such an issue and kind of honing in on that fact that we just, as a nation, we put our satellites in a similar orbit due to it being more optimal for surveillance and communication. All right, now let's talk solutions. I'm going to identify 3 solutions for you and also which one I think is going to be the most effective. I'm going to kind of talk pros and cons and let you in on what really this possible solution would do for us. So the first solution I'm going to talk to you about is active debris removal, or known as ADR. Now, active debris removal will immediately remove the debris produced by satellites, which is awesome. It encompasses the process, the technology, and the strategy to remove an immediate threat posed by a defunct satellite, a rocket body, or some other large piece of debris by nudging it into a safer orbit or forcing it to prematurely re-enter the atmosphere. So again, it's just going to force that debris to re-enter our atmosphere, and in turn, it will become out of orbit and decrease the amount of space junk we have orbiting around. ADR will remove large orbital debris by forcing it to re-enter the atmosphere or forcing it into a safer orbit where percentages of collisions are lesser. All right, so the pros of ADR. It's got a fast rate of removal. NASA study concluded that ADR of a large debris over the next 200 years at the removal rate of 1 to 5 objects per year, beginning in 2020. It would stabilize the LEO population, and other studies recommended an even faster rate of removal. So they're estimating the rate of removal for ADR would be 1 to 5 objects in space a year, which doesn't seem like a whole lot, but when you think about it, it truly is. So this ADR is going to get it done. It's going to get it removed, and it's going to do so in a fast manner, which is awesome. But there are some cons with the ADR solution. The cons are that there only clears large debris, so the smaller debris won't be cleared. It will be staying and remaining in space and in orbit. It's only going to clear the large debris. It's recommended in only low orbit at this time, which means that it could possibly be recommended in a higher orbit in a later date and time when more research is accumulated and tending on how well the low orbit clearing goes. But at this time, the European Space Agency recommended that it at a low orbit trial as soon as possible. And finally, you must obtain consent prior to the removal. ADR cannot come in and take things in space without the consent of the person that put it there. So it just says that non-consensual ADR presents a dilemma because international law does not prioritize among the opposing interests of the owner, including its budgetary constraints, potential collateral liability, and dual-use national security concerns, and those of other uses of the orbit who require the orderly and productivity use of the orbit without risk of collision. So basically, they would have to obtain a consent nationwide to remove this orbit, and when something goes wrong, collateral and liability could be on them. It just makes for a sticky situation in the lawsuit side. This could be a potential problem. Now, if they obtain consent and it all goes well, they get the green light, it may not be an issue, but it is a possibility. The reason I think ADR is a great solution is because it does definitely remove the debris fast. However, I think the cons outweigh the pros, and therefore I don't recommend this solution, but it is a possibility if needed in the future, and maybe we could continue to make developments in this solution. The next solution I'm going to introduce to you is induced hypervelocity impact of injected dust grains. Essentially what this method is going to be doing is it's going to be injecting dust grains into the debris. It provides access to the space hazards found in the research that says we present a concept for elimination of small debris by deploying micron-scale dust to artificially enhance the drag on the debris. So it's basically going to enhance the drag on the debris, which slows it down and causes it to forces it to re-enter that atmosphere. So again, essentially working towards the same goal as the ADR solution to get that debris to re-enter our atmosphere. Now, this will make access to near-Earth space hazardous without first clearing the existing debris from the region, which is kind of nice. You don't have to clear the debris before we get in there and start getting some of that redirected. Now, just as the ADR method, there are pros and cons to this second method. Now, some of the pros are that it clears small, non-trackable debris and large debris, so it's able to do both clear and small debris, which not all methods are capable of doing. We presented a dust-based concept that is uniquely effective in removing majority of the small and trackable orbital debris. The technique is also effective in removing larger objects, so that's a pro that it can move both large and small non-trackable debris. It can handle tumbling debris. Tumbling of satellites, which poses a major problem, and grabbing and removing them by robotic probes will not be an issue in the dust-based ADR technique. So it's basically going to inject this dust in it, which is going to make it have the ability to take away the debris even though it's tumbling or moving around. Some of the cons with this method is that it cannot be used for debris spread over a large volume. It needs to be in a small area or a small volume. Once it spreads, it's no longer effective. However, if the debris has already spread out over a large volume, then the suborbital dust deployment becomes impractical because the volume occupied by the debris is too large to be filled with dust. So when the area is too big, they cannot inject enough dust to make the method effective. Therefore, it's no longer effective when it's over too big of an area. The other con is that it's not sure if injected dust can stay for long periods of time. One issue of concern was whether the injected dust can be maintained in orbit stable for 10 to 15 years. If it cannot be maintained in a stable orbit for 10 to 15 years, then the method may prove to be ineffective. So the pros and the cons clearly outweigh each other in this method, but it is another proposed solution for this orbital debris issue. Now, my final and my favorite method that I prefer is the pulsed laser method. Now, this is one idea proposed by scientists as a means of slowing orbital debris and eventually causing that debris to burn up into the atmosphere. So it's going to slow down the debris and then cause the debris to burn up into our atmosphere. So it's going to kind of push it into the atmosphere and then thus burn it up, and it will no longer be in space, causing pollution to our space. A promising proposed solution uses a high-powered pulsed laser system on the Earth to make plasma jets on the objects, slowing them slightly and causing them to re-enter and burn up the atmosphere. So again, they're going to put this kind of pulsed jet on the debris. It's going to slow them down. It's going to force them to re-enter the atmosphere and then in turn burn up. The proposal will be effective for both small and large debris, which again is a great pro to this method, is that it will do both small and large debris items. The pros are that it will work for both small and large debris, as stated prior. It can handle tumbling objects as well, so when the objects are moving and they're harder to contain, it can still handle and be effective with those tumbling objects. The LODR can handle tumbling objects while mechanical grapplers cannot. It also has multiple uses. The system has multiple uses aside from general debris clearing, such as preventing collisions, increasing the accuracy of debris and fuel, and controlling where large debris impact the Earth's surface. So it's not just for the benefit of clearing that debris, but also for controlling where that large debris will impact the surface, preventing those collisions, and then increasing the accuracy of that debris and fuel. Now, there are some cons even with this preferred method. It is extremely costly. We use this estimate to cost per small object removal at a few $1,000s, that for large objects at about $1 million each. So it is going to be costly to implement this method. However, most methods do require some cost to them, so it would have to weigh out whether or not it is worth the payoff. It also requires international cooperation because we have to make sure that we can get the cooperation from the other nations to clear that space or those primary orbital spaces. So building and operating the LODR system will require international cooperation to avoid concerns that it is a weapon system. Also, cooperation in its operation will be needed to facilitate permission for its use to remove large debris objects. So they basically have to obtain consent from these other nations that they can remove or clear this debris, and they cannot clear it or remove it until they obtain that permission, which is kind of a negative on the flip side, because you've got to go through all the steps of getting that approval, and if you don't get the approval, then you aren't able to clear that debris. And finally, here are just some references I referenced to search these different solutions and the pros and cons of each. So thanks for watching my presentation.